I'm been very concerned lately about China. They are now all over Africa, buying things and investing over there and getting those countries dependent on them and supporting, non-democratic people. And I'm just
Like
wondering,
whom?
well,
We are in a country that supports Saudi Arabia.
yes, that's
Yeah?
true. Right. So
Suddenly we have a problem with, superpowers supporting non-democratic people.
yes, yes, I do. They're in Africa. They're lending money to countries to build ports and different infrastructure.
build what?
Port.
And what's wrong with
harbors.
that?
And well, because
Countries that need ports get ports.
but they're making people dependent on. I know it's the same thing that we've done, which is
No, it's not.
horrible around the world.
They are far more humanistic than the United States ever was.
Really? Okay.
Absolutely.
Great. So
Let me give you an example. Of course, they are peddling for influence.
yeah.
Yeah? But they are non-interventionist. Absolutely non-interventionist in a way that Europeans, the West, has never managed to fathom. When it comes to the influence of China outside its borders, I have to say, firstly, it's quite remarkable that they don't seem to have any military ambitions. Secondly, Africa. I'll give you an example, a specific example. Ethiopia. 2004, because it happened to be there, and I have some first-hand experience of it. They went into Ethiopia. I'll tell you why they went into Ethiopia, because they suspected there was oil. Because China is a major industrial power, but it lacks primary resources. Now, instead of going into Africa with troops, colonially, destroying the country, killing people like the West has done for the last 100 years, what they did was they went to Addis Ababa and they said to the government, we would like, we can see you have problems with your infrastructure, we would like to build some new airports, upgrade your railway system, create a telephone system, and rebuild your roads. And we'll do this all for free. No strings attached. We don't want anything from you. And they did. Why did they do it? Because this is soft power. Because because they knew that if oil is discovered, and it was discovered later, then, of course, the Ethiopian government will be much more open to Chinese oil companies coming there. They have never combined their investment with imperialistic. Can you imagine if that was a German company or an American company? That's why I'm saying I don't think you should worry.
Okay. I won't.
All right, strap yourselves in because we are diving deep today into China's influence in Africa. We've got a whole bunch of sources here, and some of them paint a pretty rosy picture of what China's doing over there, but then others, not so much. Some even raising some red flags about, dependency, long-term impacts, all that.
Yeah, it's complicated.
Exactly. So that's our mission today, to unpack all of this and figure out what's really going on.
Sounds good. I'm ready.
Okay, good. So let's kick things off with this video. It's called, get this, Candid Africa, Truthful and Unapologetic.
Catchy title.
Right. So right away, these filmmakers, they come out swinging. They lay out this tension between, on the one hand, African nations needing development, like desperately needing infrastructure, roads, ports, the whole 9 yards. And then on the other hand, you've got China pouring money into these projects, often, it seems, with fewer conditions than, say, Western lenders. So on the surface, it seems like a pretty good deal, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's not that simple, though. The video, it argues that this aid, it could be a form of what they call soft power, influencing countries without actually resorting to force.
Okay. I think I get it. But for our listeners who might not be familiar with this concept, can you break down soft power a little?
Sure. So think of it like this. Soft power is basically, it's like when a country uses things like development aid or cultural exchanges to kind of nudge other countries in a certain direction.
Ah, I see. It's all about influence.
Exactly. It's influencing without forcing,
Okay, that makes sense. But how does that actually play out in the real world?
Well, the video gives this really interesting example. They use Ethiopia as a case study. Imagine Ethiopia needs a new highway, right? And let's say China is the only one stepping up to the plate offering to build it, no strings attached. At least that's how it seems.
So where's the catch?
Well, what if, down the line, Ethiopia discovers, let's say, a huge oil reserve? Suddenly they're sitting on a gold mine, literally. But now they might feel obligated to give China a sweetheart deal on that oil, even if they could get a better price from someone else.
Because they owe China a favor, basically, for the
Wow.
highway. So it's like, even though China didn't explicitly demand anything up front, it doesn't mean there's no cost down the line.
Precisely. It's a subtle form of leverage.
Wow, that's pretty sneaky.
And that's exactly what makes this whole thing so ethically complicated.
Yeah, no kidding. And speaking of complicated, the video also makes a point of contrasting China's approach with, how Western nations have acted in Africa in the past, all that colonialism, military interventions, that sort of thing.
Right, right. They're basically saying that China is doing things differently. By focusing on development, by not engaging in those more aggressive tactics, they're positioning themselves as partners, not colonizers.
It makes you wonder, though, doesn't it?
What do you mean?
Well, is this genuine partnership? Or is it just, a more, a more subtle form of control? That's what I'm wondering.
Yeah, that is the million-dollar question. And honestly, that's exactly what we're going to be unpacking as we continue our deep dive.
Okay, so we've established that, China's putting a lot of money into Africa, but their motives, well, let's just say they're a little bit murky. And this whole soft power idea, is it really about genuine partnership, or is it some kind of calculated strategy?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And the filmmakers of Candid Africa, they're really pushing us to look at the actions, not just the words. Like, they highlight all these instances where China's policy of, non-intervention, it really stands out, especially when you compare it to how Western powers have, historically acted in Africa.
Can you give me a specific example? What are they talking about?
Sure. One example they bring up is the Rwandan genocide back in the 90s. They point out that, a lot of Western countries, even though they knew things were getting really bad in Rwanda, they didn't really do much to intervene. But China offered humanitarian aid. They supported Rwanda's rebuilding efforts after the genocide, and they did it without attaching all sorts of political conditions.
So in that case, it seems like China was actually genuinely trying to help, not just trying to control things.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
But the video, it also throws out this really thought-provoking question. It asks, does the method really matter as much as the outcome? I mean, even if China's actions seem less interventionist, less aggressive, could they still be serving their own interests in the long run? Maybe even at the expense of African nations and their ability to act independently in the future.
It's almost like they're playing the long game, right? Building up all this goodwill now so that later on they can cash in those chips.
Exactly. And that leads us right into the potential downsides of this whole soft power thing. The video argues that, all these investments, they could actually create new forms of dependency for these African countries.
But wait, hold on. Don't these countries need these investments? I mean, they need roads, hospitals, schools, all that stuff.
Of course they do. The video, it totally acknowledges that. Development is crucial. But what they're saying is that we have to be careful. We can't let these countries become too reliant on one single source of funding, especially if that source has, shall we say, its own agenda.
So what's the alternative then? I mean, if Western powers, they have this whole history of interventionism and, China's motives, well, they're not exactly crystal clear, then who's going to help these countries develop?
That's a really tough question. And honestly, the video doesn't offer any easy answers, but it does push us to really be aware of the risks and to demand more transparency and accountability in all these deals that are being made.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you know what? They even go so far as to say that China's approach might actually be more humanistic than, say, the U.S. approach. Isn't that a bit of a stretch?
Yeah. It's definitely a bold statement, but they do back it up with some pretty interesting arguments. Like, they compare China's non-intervention policy with, some historical examples of Western intervention, like, for instance, the Iraq War.
Yeah.
And they point out that, in that case, the intervention had some pretty devastating consequences.
So what they're saying is, even if China's actions are ultimately self-serving, maybe the way they go about it is, less harmful than the way Western countries have traditionally approached things.
That's one way to interpret it.
Yeah.
The video really challenges us to rethink our assumptions. Like, who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? In this whole global power dynamic, it's not always so black and white.
Yeah, no kidding. Okay, so we've talked about the potential benefits, we've talked about the potential downsides, but what does this all mean for the future of Africa? That's what I'm wondering.
And that, my friend, is exactly what we're going to be tackling in the final part of our deep dive.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground already. Talked about soft power, talked about the historical context of China in Africa. But this Candid Africa video, they bring up one more thing, kind of a final and maybe the most important concern.
Yeah, they get into how all these investments, all this money flowing in, it could actually be affecting, governance in these African countries, how they're being run.
So are they saying that China is like calling the shots, dictating policy, that kind of thing?
Not necessarily directly. It's probably more subtle than that. Think of it this way. You've got a country, let's say, where China's paid for, I don't know, massive infrastructure projects, bridges, dams, you name it. So naturally, that country's government, they owe a lot to China. They want to keep those relationships strong.
Right. Makes sense. It's like you scratch my back, I scratch yours, that kind of deal.
Exactly. But now imagine that this government, they start making decisions that, well, that maybe don't align so well with China's interests. For example, maybe they start cracking down on dissent. Or maybe they get a little too friendly with Taiwan.
Ah, I see where you're going with this. China, they could use their leverage, right? Maybe threaten to pull out of future investments, or I don't know, call in some of those loans early. All to pressure the government to change course, get back in line.
That's the idea. And the video, it actually points to some real-world examples of African leaders who, well, let's just say they've become more authoritarian, more controlling, while at the same time getting closer and closer to China. It's a tricky situation because these countries, they do need the investment. But the question is, at what cost? At what cost to their own democratic processes?
So is the video saying that China's deliberately trying to undermine democracy in Africa? Is that what they're getting at?
They don't explicitly say that. But they do raise this concern that, even indirectly, by supporting certain regimes, even if it's just through investment, China could be playing a role in a decline in good governance, a decline in human rights.
But hold on, didn't they also bring up the fact that Western powers, they also have a bit of a track record of supporting, non-democratic regimes, when it's convenient for them, of course.
Absolutely. They make that point very clearly. They even draw a direct comparison with, how the U.S. has often prioritized its own strategic interests over things like, well, democratic values, turned a blind eye to, shall we say, some pretty nasty stuff done by friendly dictators. Their point is, nobody's completely innocent here. No global power. When it comes to meddling in other countries' affairs, everyone's got their hands a little dirty.
It's like the pot calling the kettle black, isn't it?
Exactly. The Candid Africa filmmakers, they're not trying to paint China as the big bad wolf here. What they want is for us to look at this whole situation with a more critical eye, a more nuanced understanding of how all these global powers, not just China, but the West too, how they're exerting their influence and how that's impacting governance in Africa.
Wow. I've got to say, this whole deep dive has been really eye-opening. We started with infrastructure projects, and we ended up in like a global power struggle with some really, really tough ethical questions.
Yeah, it just goes to show geopolitics, it's messy. There are no easy answers.
So for our listeners, what's the big takeaway here? What should they be thinking about after listening to all of this?
I think the most important thing is we can't be naive. We have to be aware of any kind of foreign influence, especially when it comes with strings attached. Whether it's China, the U.S., anybody. We have to demand transparency, accountability, and we have to push for investments that truly benefit these African nations, investments that empower them, not just, serve the interests of whoever's holding the purse strings.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, I think that's a good place to wrap up our deep dive into China's influence in Africa. It's a topic that, well, it's definitely worth keeping an eye on and thinking critically about. So until next time, thanks for joining us and keep asking those tough questions.